Matthew, good afternoon. Thank you very much for giving time for this interview.
I'm sorry my office is so hot.
It is a very hot afternoon, isn't it? I want to start by asking what you thought the biggest achievement was with your commission on work.
Well, I think I was pleased that we did it. We did it in time, and we delivered a report that I think was reasonably coherent and comprehensive, and seemed to generate, quite a high level of agreement. So, in a sense, when you
level agreement amongst
the kind of people whose opinion I valued, I was never going to please certain people on the left in the trade unions who it was very clear from early on would have wanted me to go further, and who I think
further in what direction?
Well, banning 0 hours contracts and things like that. So
right.
there was further that there were political agendas, and it was clear to me pretty early on that I was unlikely to get the support of the Labour Party or the trade union movement for political reasons. This was something set up by the government, and it was to advise this government on where they should go, and to an extent I was informed by what I understood this kind of government would be willing to do. It was a commission to this government, knowing this government's kind of assumptions, having spoken to people and officials, and so I wanted to make a difference. I didn't want to kind of just wave a banner in the air. So in a way, I think for the left to an extent, the very idea of a report which might be accepted by this government would mean that it couldn't possibly be any good. So I understood that. And there will be people who were less vociferous publicly, but would have been vociferous behind the scenes, who didn't believe there should be any more regulation of any kind. And so let's discount the kind of free market fundamentalists and those who think anything to do with anything that commissioned by this government must be a disaster. The rest of people were broadly positive about it, and agree with every bit of it, but they were broadly positive. So I think there was a kind of job done element of this, because in the end, anything you do like this, any review, you're in the lap of the gods, whether or not the government does anything with it. And there isn't a perfect correlation between the quality of a review and its likelihood of being acted upon. So first thing I'm pleased about is we did a good piece of work, we handed it over, and most people thought it was a credible and useful thing to have done. In terms of what's happened since, the thing I'm most pleased about is that the concept of good work seems to have taken wing to a certain extent. I mean, I do a lot of events and talks about this to trade associations and sector associations and organisations that work in the employment space, and I've been involved in an initiative by Carnegie to define the metrics for good work. So this idea of good work, the idea,
and you think that was something new that the commission sort of basically, that was one of the big ideas.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't really think that anything is new, in the sense that I think if you look at the history of inventions, the person who gets credit for it nearly always has a team around them, and that someone else somewhere else in the world was just about to invent the same thing. So, if Matthew Taylor hadn't existed and this review hadn't existed, it may well have been that something very similar would have come along, because it was a moment. And I think it was a moment where the public, when I was in government, the Labour government, there was a philosophy that was work first, and you'd hear the phrase work first, and the view was what matters preeminently is getting people into a job of any kind, because the fundamental difference, the big differences between your economic and life prospects if you've got a job, and your economic and life prospects if you haven't got a job, particularly if you're without a job for a sustained period of time. And that view was a view where when I was in government as an advisor, had I gone to meetings particularly with Treasury or DWP, the Department of Work and Pensions, and said, what about quality of work? I think people would have said, I would have been immediately revealed myself as somebody who wasn't on the project, who didn't understand the core assumptions.
Yeah.
So we are ready as a country, I think, partly because we are in a healthy position in terms of quantity of work, low unemployment, high labour market participation. We are ready now for a conversation about quality of work, and add to that the expose of bad practice, and the technological possibilities, particularly of platform companies, and you've got this kind of heady brew, and into that brew my report fell. What I am proud of, I think, if I can give myself any kind of credit, is that I didn't write a report with just a set of recommendations for addressing problems at the bottom end of the labour market. I did try to surface this broader concept of good work, and that seems to have hit home, and the government is committed to good work being part of its industrial strategy, and reporting on the quality of work. So I think that's good.
And they've made that public commitment,
Yeah.
because there isn't a formal response to the your report yet.
There is a formal response. They responded to. I mean, it's slightly.
Because it's not. I went to the website actually. I was thinking.
There's been a formal response to my report, which is called Good Work, and the government produced a response called Good Work.
Right.
I might tell you something about how much bandwidth they've got in government. They couldn't even think
of their own idea.
They can have a Good Work 2 this
Yeah.
time. It's personal. Good Work 2 in space. No one can hear you scream, or whatever it might have been. But they said that they were acting on just about every recommendation in the report. What actually that meant was that they are taking forward those things which can be done without legislation, and I think they will report gradually on how they'll take those things forward.
Right.
And they're consulting on the things that would require primary legislation or more concerted action. And so what I've said publicly, which is a bit inept actually, I have to say, because it enables journalists to cut off the sentence halfway through, but what I've been saying publicly is, look, I give the government 4 out of 10, but it could rise to 8 out of 10 because it depends on how they're going to respond to these big things that they're currently consulting on: employment status, some kind of recognition in the minimum wage of non-guaranteed hours, better rights for information, consultation, and representation at work. So quite a lot of the important stuff is subject to consultation.
So those sort of dimensions, I suppose, of good work, I mean, just sort of unpacking that concept, that's about something about security and rights and things like that. Is that, I mean, I suppose when people might think good work's about meaningful work or development or learning or expressing yourself, those sorts of dimensions, how do they fit
So I
in?
think that there are 3 points to make here. The first is one I've already made, so I won't labour it, which is I still believe in the end that almost any job is better than sustained unemployment. Right?
Yeah.
And at least if you've got a job, at least if it's not a great job, there is the possibility of advancing or moving from there. It's just easier to get job B if you've got job A than it is to get job A if you haven't got a job, right?
Yeah.
So I still believe that, and I don't think, and in my report was very clear about this, we shouldn't do anything to jeopardise the fact that we're quite good at creating jobs. And we have quite high level labour force participation rates. Secondly, we have to recognise that unlike job quantity, which is an objective fact, you either have a job or you don't have a job, job quality is subjective, and we've all done, I've worked in a bar, I've been on a supermarket checkout, I've done those jobs, and one of the challenges about platforms like Deliveroo is a good example. A lot of people who work on Deliveroo are, they're students, or they're between jobs, or they're filling in various ways, and you have to recognise that what people want from work does depend on where they are and who they are and what stage of life they are. And it's very important to understand that, because if you don't recognise that, you're in danger of kind of saying, well, look, this is what work quality is, and if you don't care about the same things I care about, then somehow you're inadequate. So that's the second. The third thing, however, having made those 2 points, is that there is, I think the research does indicate, a fairly clear kind of Maslow's hierarchy, if you like. If you kind of think of a kind of pyramid where most people get the stuff at the bottom, and then fewer and fewer people get the stuff as it goes up the kind of pyramid. And so at the bottom is people do want decent terms and conditions. They need enough money to survive on, and that's hard now. And basic conditions, health and safety, things like that. Then they want. Then things like security, family-friendly working, so aspects of the design of the job. So they're also important. Then you start to get into things that are more about. So one way of thinking about this, I think, is to talk about things that are characteristics of the job, the pay, the conditions. Then things that are characteristic of the person's experience of the job. So then you get into the kind of sense of autonomy. Respect. Do you feel you're listened to? Do you feel you're respected? Do you feel you personally have got prospects in this job? Do you feel that this job enables you to balance work and family life? Right? So these are kind of characteristics of for the person. And then the highest level is characteristics of the organisation, which is, do you feel that you are working in an organisation that has a purpose that you subscribe to? Do you feel a strong sense of teamwork in the organisation you're in? So I think that's one interesting way of looking at it. I haven't kind of fully thought this through, but the baseline is the characteristics of the job, then the characteristics of the way in which that job interacts with you and your aspirations and desires, and then thirdly, the nature of the organisation that you are in. And the best possible jobs are ones where people feel that they get paid enough and that the conditions are fine, that they personally can grow and develop and balance it with their job, but also that they work in an organisation where they really feel motivated and excited by what that organisation is trying to do.
And that, I suppose, that last bit is the most tricky in a sense, particularly in that, you know, a lot of our organisations are shaped and maybe more shaped around maximising returns to shareholders and finding ways to make more money. And I suppose maybe people may not relate to that or feel that's meaningful for them.
Yeah, I think there's two issues here actually. I think one is the kind of ultimate purpose of the organisation, and of course you're right that if you're an organisation that espouses a broader purpose, but yet you suspect that it's dragged hither and thither by the self-interest of the executive or the short-term demands of the shareholders, that's kind of problematic. But the other thing I think is it's also about the way in which the organisation works. I think, you know, large bureaucracies, however benign their ultimate objective, are not nice places, are often rather demoralising places to work in.
Yeah.
So I think just as important to people as the ultimate purpose of the organisation is how that purpose is translated into their day-to-day experience of the organisation. You know, so that's why a lot of people in the public sector don't have great morale. It's not because they don't, you know, a lot of teachers don't have great morale. And that's not because they don't care about children. They don't think that educating children isn't the most wonderful thing you can do. It's because they are bowed down by regulation and, you know, fear of Ofsted and, you know, all of the kind of those kind of aspects of the job. So you need to do both things. You need to be purposeful organisations, but also people need to feel they can live that purpose in their day-to-day jobs. And I think, again, as I say, in the public sector in particular, a lot of people are in jobs that ought to feel meaningful, but actually they feel the way the organisation runs means that they, indeed, one of the things that is most demoralising to them is it doesn't, for a lot of the time, it doesn't really feel clear how what they're doing contributes to what they thought they were trying to achieve.
So they were inspired to do it. They believe in what to do, but actually the organisation is to some extent getting in the way of that.
Yeah. So, for example, we did a report. A colleague of mine called Julian Astor did a report called the Ideal School Exhibition, which is about mission-driven schools. And these are schools with a clear mission, but where everyone in the organisation feels that mission. He contrasted that with a lot of schools where it feels like what's going on a lot of the time is gaming. And so what those teachers know they're really about is doing what needs to be done to make sure that school doesn't fall into special measures and have Ofsted landing on it, you know. And that's, you know, to a certain extent that's aligned with children's success and development, but there are elements of it that aren't, you know, focusing all your resources on kind of children at the borderline between two grades and things like that.
Yeah. I mean, this is very interesting, isn't it? Because there's obviously a lot of challenge to models of the private sector and shareholder-driven models that, again, play games to try and pull as much value out of other people as possible. But the sort of to go back and say, oh, but the public service is great, obviously, is that also brings a lot of problems. So were the sort of models of organisations where you think that sort of are somewhere in between or new models emerging?
Right. Well, so this gives me an opportunity, although I'll do it in short order because we haven't got that much time, but to offer a kind of the framework through which I think about these issues. So I use a kind of framework that is primarily based upon a sociological theory, but is also actually echoes psychological theory as well. So I'll describe both and then take you to what this means for organisations. So the psychological theory, which I think is well attested, is the basis of a lot of social psychology, is that human beings have got three fundamental kind of categories of motivation. And these categories are often defined as mastery, which is kind of like doing the best you can at the thing that you do. Connectedness, which is our desire to be connected to other people, part of a tribe, a group, a sense of belonging. And autonomy, our desire to be the authors of our own fate. And these are the fundamental motivators of human beings, the intrinsic motivators of human beings: mastery, autonomy, connectedness. Now, there's a different theory derived from sociology, from anthropology, from the work of Mary Douglas and people who followed after her. And that's around what might be kind of, the way that I talk about it is the way in which people do things together. And that has a categorization which is interestingly similar. So that would talk about organisations, cultures within organisations being hierarchical, that is to say, being
Yeah.
about authority and strategy and leadership and rules, and a notion that the way you get people to do things is through hierarchical means.
Yeah.
Solidarity, which says what it's about is belonging and membership, and the way you get people to do things is their values and their sense of belonging, and individualism, which is one other way you get people to do things is to kind of appeal to their self-interest, enlightened or otherwise. The sociology is interesting. The fourth category, which is fatalism, which is a kind of view which is, actually we're screwed, nothing's going to work.
Yes.
You can kind of forget it all.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I prefer the sociological theory to the psychological theory is the psychological theory says implicitly all good things go together, and the sociological theory says no, actually these things, the hierarchical, solidaristic individual, are in tension. They're constantly in tension. They're constantly battling it out as ways of getting people to do stuff. Now, I often cite a piece of research. It wasn't a huge piece of research. In fact, Charlie Leadbeater, whose research is, I think, kind of often is rather amused by the fact that I get quoted a lot more talking about his research than he does. But
Yeah.
he looked at a number of very innovative organisations, Pixar, Barcelona Football Club, an Indian social enterprise bringing affordable education to thousands of villages, and the Cambridge Molecular Biology Lab, I think. He looked at these organisations. Why are they innovative, he asked. And he came up with a phrase to describe them. He said they are creative communities with a cause. Now, the reason that I talk about this more than Charlie does, who's moved on to other projects, is, of course, this absolutely chimes with that theory. Because what it says is that the best organisation to work in, the most innovative organisation, cause. It's got leadership that is about mission, strategy. It's not self-serving, it's not overbearing. Community, a sense of being in a team committed to doing something special. By the way, not community that's inward looking,
Yeah.
but community in these cases committed to making fantastic films, playing wonderful football, bringing education to children, and then creative organisations where there is an assumption that people can and should be trusted to take initiative, to try things out, to experiment with things, to solve problems. So for me, what you're trying to do is build creative communities with a cause. You're trying to align hierarchy, authority, and solidarity. Now, you talked about the private sector and the public sector. I think that there is a tendency of private sector organisations to be weak in the solidarity bit. So private sector organisations are good at hierarchy and authority and rules, and they're quite good at self-interest and performance-rated pay and bonuses and competition.
Yeah.
Try as they might, they're not terribly convincing on the kind of, great mission thing, for reasons that...
They work hard at it, but
Yeah.
some do anyway.
I was in a bank a couple of years ago, and the bank had its values in its lobby in a big glass sculpture, which of course led people to go, of course this bank you can see right through their values. The public sector's problem, which I'm sure you will also be able to concur with, is it's good at hierarchy, it's pretty good at values, it's not very good at individualism, it's not very good at creating the spaces for people to take initiative and solve problems themselves.
Yeah.
So I think that, my account would be both the public and private sector have challenges about being the best possible workplaces, the most wonderful places to work. They get the very best out of people, but they're slightly different kinds of problems. Now, what you've had in the public sector for the last 30 years has been new public management. And new public management was an explicit attempt to drive individualistic methods, markets and incentives into the public sector. It's failed. And the reason it's failed, which takes me back to why I think this theory is so interesting, is you can't just bolt things on. So, and exactly the same is true as the private sector, because the equivalent failure for the private sector of the failure of new public management in the public sector is corporate social responsibility, because corporate social responsibility is the attempt to bolt values onto organisations. But you can't do that, because part of the reason new public management failed in the public sector is you can't really have these individualistic methods in systems which are still publicly accountable, that still have to deliver equity.
Yeah.
You need to redesign the whole thing if you're going to do that, not just bolt these things on. And the reason it hasn't worked in the private sector is, of course, you be eloquent on this, but if you don't challenge the fundamental business model, the shareholder value model, for example, then your attempt to bolt these values on
Just doesn't work.
Isn't going to work.
So I know you've just launched a new good work program in the RSA. So how does that thinking inform this new initiative, and how does what's shaping that?
Yeah, I try my best not to impose my theoretical frameworks on everyone at the RSA.
Not being a hierarchical organisation.
I think I put ideas out there, and if people find them useful, they use them, and that's great. Actually, we have a phrase that we use to describe change, and that will be used in our future work approach, which is we talk about thinking like a system and acting like an entrepreneur.
Yes.
And I think in that we use the framework I've just described. So when we look at a system, one of the things we look at, the lens we look at a system through, is how is authority working in that system? How are values working in that system? And how are incentives working in that system? And if you wanted to reimagine the system, you'd have to reimagine all of those things. And then secondly, in terms of the entrepreneurial bit, if you want to achieve change in that system, where is it that change looks imminent? Is it in the leadership? Is there some disconnect in the values? Is there a legitimacy issue that you can maybe open up and exploit to shift things? Or is there something in the incentives that you could do? Is there, innovation, entrepreneurship that might change the system? So we do use that framework, broadly speaking. And in our future work, I think what we'll be doing is looking at the impact of technology on particular sectors, but in a kind of whole system approach. So not just saying, well, here's the technology, it's got the capacity to do X, let's introduce it. But, well, what does that mean for the service? What does that mean for the workers? What does that mean for the public's perception of that sector? What does it mean for the underlying purpose of that activity in that sector? So we will, I think, attempt to bring to our analysis of the future work a kind of whole system analysis.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. That has been absolutely fascinating, and thanks very much for the time.